This is the lecture on interacting with the world, states of consciousness. If you haven't already done so, go ahead and open up the PowerPoint lecture for states of consciousness. One of the things that I would like for you to realize is that we operate from day to day in various states of consciousness. Rarely are we either fully awake or fully asleep. Oftentimes we have states of consciousness that are sort of in between being fully awake and fully asleep. To demonstrate, I'd like to read for you a few scenarios, and I want you to determine whether or not you have ever experienced this or if this has ever happened to you. Here's the first example. Suddenly realizing when you are driving the car that you don't remember what has happened during all or part of the trip. If this has happened to you, psychologists call this highway hypnosis, and it is fairly common. That is, you are in sort of a quasi-awake state, but you are not necessarily fully conscious and alert. How about this scenario? Suddenly realizing when you are listening to someone talk that you did not hear part or all of what the person said. This is fairly common and represents a dissociation. Again, you are not fully consciously aware and in the moment. How about this one? Getting off an elevator on the wrong floor. Once again, if your mind starts to wander or drift and you are not in a fully conscious or alert state, this can happen to you. Similarly, have you ever walked into a room and not remembered why you walked into the room? Same idea. So as you can see, we have various states of consciousness that are somewhere in between fully awake and fully asleep. How about this one? Becoming so absorbed in watching television or a movie that you are unaware of other events happening around you. That can happen. When you get so absorbed, you sort of block out everything that's going on around you, and you are no longer fully aware or fully conscious of those events. And how about this last one? Finding that you cannot remember whether or not you have just done something or perhaps had just thought about doing it. For example, not knowing whether you have just mailed a letter or have just thought about mailing it. This is fairly common and is another example of the continuum between full alert consciousness and full sleep. So what I'd like to focus on today are the different stages of consciousness, talk a little bit about sleep, and then get into sleep problems and dreams. If you're taking a look at the PowerPoint, you'll notice that the first slide has information about the electroencephalogram, or EEG. The EEG is the instrument that we use to determine what state of consciousness a person is in. The EEG primarily measures electrical activity in the cortex. The electrodes that are used to record the activity are placed at different positions all over the scalp. So basically, the EEG picks up electrical signals from the cortex. When a person is fully awake and alert, the EEG pattern that emerges is called a beta wave. This is a very high frequency wave, as you can see from the table, about 13 to 24 cycles per second, or 13 to 24 hertz, and it is a very rapid wave. So it is a very short, fast wave. And what that indicates is that different areas of the cortex are doing different things, which is what you would expect during full consciousness. Your frontal lobe is doing the planning, organizing, thinking. The parietal lobe is processing sensory information. The temporal lobe is processing auditory information. The occipital lobe is processing visual information. So all of the different lobes of the cortex are doing different things. As a result, the electrical activity is what we call desynchronized. The frontal lobe electrical activity is much different from the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. So when you average together all of the electrical activity going on, it almost cancels itself out, because when one area is active, one might not be for a moment, and then that might change. So hence we see this pattern of very high frequency, low amplitude waves because there is a lot of desynchronized electrical activity going on during full consciousness, full alertness. So that is what the beta pattern represents. As we begin to transition into a more relaxed state and states that are achieved by people in a meditative state, this EEG signal is known as an alpha wave. An alpha wave is a little bit slower in terms of frequency, on the order of 8 to 12 cycles per second, or 8 to 12 hertz, and it represents the beginning of a synchronization of the different areas of the cortex, because each area is no longer particularly active. So the alpha pattern tends to be somewhat transitional, as we're moving from being fully conscious and alert to being fully asleep. Then as we move down into a deeper state of actual sleep, we see the next pattern emerge on the EEG, which is called a theta wave. A theta wave is even slower, 4 to 7 cycles per second, and this is indicative of light sleep. So as we move down deeper into different stages of sleep, the EEG pattern becomes slower, but the waves themselves become larger because cortical activity is beginning to synchronize. That is, the electrical activity from all of the different areas happen at about the same time. The same type of activation is happening, so the signals begin to add up instead of canceling each other out. The last wave that we see on the EEG is called the delta pattern, or a delta wave. This is the slowest wave of all. This is less than 4 cycles per second, and this wave is indicative of someone who is in deep sleep. These are the largest, most synchronized EEG waves that we see on the graph. If you take a look at the next slide, you can see examples of caps that are worn as an EEG is being recorded. Now, the electrodes can be directly applied to the scalp with a little bit of conductance gel, but it's also a common scenario in that a cap is placed over the head, and you can see all the different electrode positions on these different caps. At the same time, especially if we're interested in one particular stage of sleep called REM, or rapid eye movement, a person who is undergoing an EEG study or a sleep study may have additional electrodes placed around the eye to capture eye movements behind the closed eyelids. So let's take a look at the early stages of sleep on the next slide. There are approximately 5 stages of sleep. 4 are the traditional stages of sleep, and then stage 5 is called REM, or rapid eye movement. Stage 1 of sleep is a very light, quick stage. Stage 1 sleep only lasts between 5 and 10 minutes. It is considered to be a very transitional sleep stage. During stage 1, the EEG pattern will change from beta waves to alpha waves and end in theta waves. When we see the emergence of theta waves, then we know the person is moving into stage 2. So in stage 1 of sleep, we move from beta waves to alpha waves to theta waves. During this stage, a person may incorporate elements of what is going on around them into this light sleep, so you almost feel like you're in a half dream, half awake state. Also during this stage, a very interesting physical phenomenon occurs, and this is known as a hypnic jerk. A hypnic jerk is as you're drifting off to sleep and you suddenly feel like you're falling, or you're going over a cliff, or you trip, or something like that happens. Sometimes people experience hypnic jerks as just a twitching movement as they're drifting off into sleep. But the clinical term for that physical response to drifting into sleep is called a hypnic jerk. This is the actual clinical term for it, and it happens to everybody. As we move into stage 2 sleep, the dominant EEG pattern is a theta wave. Stage 2 sleep is a little bit longer. It lasts between 10 and 25 minutes. During this stage, the only remarkable thing besides the theta wave activity is a short burst of electrical activity known as a sleep spindle. In a moment, we'll take a look at actual EEG patterns, and you'll be able to see that sleep spindle. It is just a brief burst of high-frequency electrical activity, and this activity is believed to come from an area below the cortex, but that is a sign of stage 2 sleep. If you take a look at the next slide, you will see the next stages of sleep. Stages 3 and 4 combined are known as deep sleep, or what we call slow wave sleep. Slow wave sleep lasts for about 30 minutes at a time. The EEG pattern in slow wave sleep is predominantly a delta pattern, the slowest, largest of all of the EEG waves. It is during slow wave sleep that we see a lot of interesting phenomena with respect to dreaming and sleep patterns, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. But this is where we experience our deep sleep. Stage 3 and 4 sleep is critical because during this deep slow wave sleep is when the body engages in repair and rest and maintenance. This is not a stage that can be skipped for very long periods of time. The body actually needs it to recuperate. Without it, in other words, with extreme sleep deprivation, we might begin to see physical problems such as illness and stress-related diseases. So stages 3 and 4 are critical stages of sleep. The last stage is probably the most interesting stage of sleep. This is known as rapid eye movement, or REM sleep, and sometimes it's referred to as stage 5. A REM sleep phase lasts for about 30 minutes, and what is most interesting about REM sleep is that during this phase, the EEG pattern shows beta wave activity. So although REM sleep is actually a form of deep sleep, according to the EEG, it almost looks as if the person is awake. So REM sleep is sometimes called paradoxical sleep, because even though it is actually deep sleep, the EEG pattern shows a much different story. It shows a pattern of someone who looks like he or she is awake. During the REM state is when we have our most active dreaming phases. Everybody dreams, whether or not you remember that you dreamt, but most dreams happen during REM stages. However, it is important that the body does not act out the dreams. In other words, if you're dreaming that you're running, you don't want to actually be running in your sleep. Or if you're in a fight, you don't want to be punching and kicking in your sleep. So during REM sleep, a signal is sent from the brain down to the spinal cord to prevent people from moving. That way they don't act out their dreams. And this state is called muscle atonia. So during a REM state, your skeletal muscles are essentially paralyzed, thus preventing people from acting out their dreams. Unfortunately, there is a disorder called REM sleep disorder in which people do act out their dreams, much to the chagrin of partners sleeping in the bed next to them. This can be treated with medication, but it is something that needs to be diagnosed so that the partner is not, unfortunately, beaten up because the person with REM sleep disorder is acting out his or her dreams. If you take a look at the next slide, this is a summary of the different EEG patterns that are displayed during different stages of consciousness. Across the top, you see fully awake, and these are beta waves. So as you can see, very fast, low amplitude. In other words, they're short. These are fast, short waves. That is the beta pattern. As you move from being fully awake into stage 1 sleep, you're going to transition through alpha waves. Notice they're a little bit taller, and it's hard to tell from this slide, but they're also just a little bit slower than beta waves. Then when we move into stage 1 sleep, we see changing over from alpha into theta, And when we start to see theta waves emerge, we know the person is transitioning now into stage 2 sleep. In stage 2 sleep, we see predominantly theta waves, so the waves are getting progressively slower, they're stretched out a little bit more, and also progressively larger in amplitude. And we also see that sleep spindle, that quick burst of electrical activity that is prominent during stage 2 sleep. As we move into deeper sleep, stages 3 and 4, notice the EEG pattern begins to change remarkably into the delta wave. Very large, very slow waves. So large amplitude, but very low frequency. And then as we move into REM sleep, notice the pattern almost resembles something like beta activity. So we again start to see the high frequency, low amplitude waves that would almost indicate that someone is awake when he or she is actually in deep sleep. What I want to go over next is how these different sleep stages show themselves over the course of a good night's sleep. If you take a look at the next slide, there is part 1 of a typical night's sleep, assuming that someone goes to bed or falls asleep around 11 o'clock. So as you can see across the top of this slide is the hours over the course of the night, and I want you to understand our pattern of sleep as we progress through the night. When we first fall asleep, as you can see on the graph, we move from full wakefulness to stage 1, then down to stage 2, down to stage 3, down to stage 4. And notice during this time there are some dreams as indicated by the bottom band. Then as we get out of stage 4 sleep, we begin to move back up through the stages of sleep. So we move back from stage 4 up to stage 3, up to stage 2, and then we enter our first REM stage. So if you take a look at that first cycle, it runs approximately an hour and a half. Each full sleep cycle is about 90 minutes. From wakefulness going all the way down to stage 4, then going back up to a REM state. So at the beginning of the night, we spend a good bit of time in deep sleep and only a little bit of time in REM sleep. So this is something that I want you to know. At the beginning of the night, we spend a good deal of time in deep, slow wave sleep. That's the restorative, recuperative sleep that everybody needs so the body can maintain itself, and just a little bit of time in REM. Now during REM, we have a lot of dreaming. Again, whether or not the dream is remembered, dreaming is happening. Then we move back down through the sleep stages again. So we go back down through stage 2, then to stage 3, then stage 4, and then back up again. So you'll notice on the last part of this slide, the REM stage is beginning to get a little bit longer. So let's move to the next slide where we can see the continuation of that night's sleep. So over on the left side, that is the continuation of that REM state. And the first thing I want you to notice is that as we go through the later part of the night, we are spending less time in deep, slow wave sleep and more time in REM. So over the course of the night, the pattern changes. Toward the end of the night, getting on into morning, we spend more time in a REM phase. So that is why it is more likely that when you wake up in the morning, often by artificial means like an alarm clock, you are going to be waking up out of a dream. You are going to be waking up out of a REM state because more time is spent in REM than pretty much in any other state during the later hours of the night. So as you can see again, during the REM stages, there is a lot of dreaming going on. If you take a look at the next slide, I just wanted to show you a graph of the percentage of time that people spend in REM sleep and non-REM sleep at different points during their life. If you look across the bottom x-axis, those are different ages, and on the y-axis is the total daily sleep in hours. So if you look all the way on the left side of this graph, what you're going to notice is that newborns, very, very young infants, spend a disproportionate amount of time in REM. Almost 50% of their time spent sleeping is spent in a REM state. What they're dreaming about, I have no idea, but they're in a REM state a good bit of the time. Notice as we age, we spend less total time in REM over the course of the night. Usually by about the time we're in our teenage years or even late childhood, it begins to average out to about 20%. So about 20% of our night's sleep is spent in REM. The other thing I want you to notice is that as we age, in general, we need less sleep. People sleep less on average when they are older than when they are younger. Very young babies need up to 16 hours of sleep per day. So out of a 24-hour day, most of the time is spent sleeping. Then as we age, that number goes all the way down to about 6 hours a night. Older individuals usually average about 6 hours a night worth of sleep. So children need more sleep, adolescents and young adults need a little bit less sleep, and older individuals require the least sleep of all. But once we get past early childhood, about 20% of that total sleep time is spent in REM. If you take a look at the next slide, there is an image of the system that is used to wake us up out of a sleep state. When we talked about the brain and behavior, one of the structures that I wanted you to know was called the reticular formation. The reticular formation is responsible for monitoring our sleep and wake cycles, and it is down deep in the hindbrain. So there is a structure in the reticular formation that is responsible for releasing norepinephrine to get the brain to wake up. That is a major neurotransmitter that helps us wake up in the morning. That system is called the ARAS. It's part of the reticular formation, and that stands for the Ascending Reticular Activation System. So you don't need to know the whole name, but I do want you to know ARAS. As you can see, this structure sends projections to many different areas of the cortex, essentially helping it to get out of a sleep state and back into normal awake consciousness. So this area in particular is responsible for moving us out of a sleep state into a fully awake or alert state, the ARAS. If you take a look at the next slide, I want to mention some problems that are fairly common with respect to sleep. The most common one is insomnia. Insomnia can affect 10 to 15% of people chronically. All of us can have trouble sleeping from time to time, usually due to a change in schedule or a stressful situation or some other factor. In other words, the insomnia is readily explained and is temporary. But some people experience chronic insomnia. They have chronic issues with falling asleep or staying asleep. So the two most common forms of insomnia are known as onset insomnia and maintenance insomnia. Onset insomnia is having trouble falling asleep. So you go to bed, go through your nightly ritual to get yourself ready for bed, and then you just lie there awake, unable to fall asleep. The other common form of insomnia is called maintenance insomnia. This is when people have trouble staying asleep. So they have no problem getting to sleep and falling asleep, but then somewhere in the middle of the night, they will wake up and not be able to get back to sleep. So these are the two most common, and sometimes people experience both. The trouble with insomnia is that usually the course of treatment for it is sleeping pills. Sleeping pills often work in the GABA system. The GABA the GABA system is our major inhibitory neurotransmitter system. So, one of the theories regarding insomnia is that there is not enough GABA to quiet the brain's cortical activity when it's time to sleep. So most sleeping pills work by enhancing GABA function. Other sleeping aids work by enhancing melatonin, which is a hormone that helps us get to sleep and stay asleep. The problem with sleeping pills is that most of them will help us get to sleep, but they prevent us from experiencing deep, slow-wave sleep. In other words, when you're under sleeping pills, you don't get as much stage 3 and stage 4 sleep as you need. As a result, you may get a quote full night's sleep in that you are asleep for the night, but you're not getting as much deep sleep as you need. That's the sleep that will prevent you from being tired the next day. So as a result, taking sleeping pills can result in a vicious cycle. You take them to get to sleep, and you do sleep, but you still feel tired the next day. So you keep taking them to make sure you get to sleep, but when you do sleep, you're not getting the deep sleep that you need. Sleeping pills are not meant to be a long-term solution to insomnia. They are meant to be a temporary fix to help you get some sleep while you are working on the issues that are causing the insomnia. So this is very important. People should not be on sleeping aids long term because over that long term they prevent the deep sleep that is needed. Similarly, alcohol will also prevent deep sleep. Alcohol also works in the GABA system. So after a night of drinking, someone will say, oh, I fell asleep right away and I slept for 8 hours, which might be true, but during those 8 hours you did not necessarily get the deep sleep that you needed, so you may still feel tired and groggy the next day. So there is some truth to the fact that alcohol can help you relax to get to sleep, but overindulgence in alcohol is going to prevent you from getting that deep sleep that you need. The next sleep problem on the slide is sleep apnea. Sleep apnea is a phenomenon in which a person stops breathing during sleep. It is predicted by heavy snoring, but people who are heavy snorers aren't actually necessarily going to develop sleep apnea. So what happens over the course of the night is that people stop breathing, they may wake up, sort of gasping for air, start breathing again, and then fall back asleep. But they might not even consciously wake up. They might still be sort of half asleep when they wake up and start breathing again. As a result, people with sleep apnea often complain of being tired all the time because they're not getting good sleep. They keep waking up over the course of the night to start breathing again. Unfortunately, very rarely, but it does happen, that there are cases of sleep apnea in which a person will stop breathing during sleep and not start breathing again, making it essentially a fatal disease. So if you have problems with feeling tired or groggy and you think this might be an issue, by all means go to a sleep lab and have this diagnosed. There are machines that help people continue to breathe during the night to make sure that apnea does not happen, and as a result, you feel much more awake and alert and refreshed the next day. There are particular problems associated with different stages of sleep. What I want to mention first are problems associated with slow wave or deep stage 3 and stage 4 sleep. One of them is called somnambulism. Somnambulism is the clinical term for sleepwalking. Sleepwalking happens during deep sleep, during stage 3 or stage 4 sleep. During a sleepwalking episode, a person usually will engage in some mundane activity. He or she might walk into the living room and sit down on the couch, or walk into the kitchen and open the refrigerator. But this is a person who is truly asleep. If we had a mobile EEG attached to this person, they would be showing a delta pattern. He or she is actually asleep. Sometimes, in rare cases, a person who is sleepwalking might unlock the door and walk outside or walk down the street. But usually we're talking about fairly mundane activities. I have yet to hear of a case in which a person actually harmed somebody else during a sleepwalking state and was acquitted for it. So I don't think the sleepwalking defense is a very useful one because, like I said, usually people don't sleepwalk and inflict harm on other people. There is an urban myth that it is dangerous to wake someone who is in a sleepwalking state, and that's simply not true. What might be dangerous is if you wake someone up and they have no idea how they got there or what you're doing standing there trying to wake them up. They may become extremely agitated. So agitation might be a danger because they might not respond well to being woken up and then being confused as to where they are and why you're standing there. But in terms of an actual physical danger or health risk to a person, there is no issue like that with waking someone up in a sleepwalking state. So like I said, agitation and confusion may lead to irritation and aggression, which might be dangerous, but there are no actual health risks to the person associated with waking them up in a sleepwalking state. Usually the person will end up falling asleep on the couch or a chair or find his or her way back to bed, so it really isn't a dangerous situation for anybody involved. Only if they end up leaving the house and walking down the street might it be an actual safety risk for that person. The other problem I want to mention during slow wave sleep is called night terrors. Night terrors are bad dreams, but these are dreams that are not associated with a lot of imagery. In other words, a night terror is more of an experience of a feeling of dread, or a feeling of anxiety, or a feeling of being scared, without actually having the images of something scary to go along with it. Night terrors are quite common in young children. So a young child may wake up screaming in the middle of the night, and the parent runs into the room and says, "What's wrong?" And the child might say, "Well, I had a bad dream." And the parent says, "Well, what did you dream about?" And the child might say, "I don't know, but it was scary," or "I was scared." And that can be truthful. In a night terror, you have the feeling of fear or dread or apprehension without actually being able to explain what it is that's causing those feelings. But they are quite scary, bad dreams. Again, night terrors are more likely to happen during slow wave or deep sleep. During the REM stage, we also see some potential issues. One is nightmares. Different from a night terror, a nightmare is what we typically consider a bad dream. A bad dream associated with images of something scary or something bad happening. That is a nightmare. So nightmares happen during REM sleep because they are usually associated with negative imagery that makes us fearful or scared or sad or a combination of all of them. The other sleep problem during REM that I want you to know is called narcolepsy. Narcolepsy is a clinical condition in which a person, without warning, will suddenly fall asleep. So he or she can be standing there just talking or standing there not doing anything and suddenly fall into sleep. When a person enters that sleep stage, it is usually a REM stage. So what is interesting in people with narcolepsy is that they don't go through stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4 sleep or anything like that. They actually enter a REM state immediately. When a person with narcolepsy enters the sleep stage suddenly, that can last for anywhere between 5 to 30 minutes, and then he or she wakes up and is fine. But what is puzzling about narcolepsy is that the onset of that sudden sleep is not easily predicted. It may be brought on by stress, but not necessarily. So one of the concerns is that people with narcolepsy have to take special precautions. if they operate heavy machinery, or if they are driving. Typically, the medications prescribed for narcolepsy are some sort of stimulant drug to prevent people from falling asleep suddenly and without warning. If you take a look at the bottom, there is a website that I'm not sure is still active, but might be, but shows an example of a small dog who has narcolepsy, just so you can get a sense of how quickly an organism moves from being fully awake to fully asleep. In this video, a dachshund is running across the field, and all of a sudden he just drops into deep sleep. Without warning, just suddenly. That is how rapidly a narcoleptic attack can occur. On the next slide is just a summary of the different types of sleep phenomena and when they tend to occur. If you take a look at the beginning of the night, when we are most likely to be experiencing deep sleep, that is often when we see the appearance of sleepwalking or somnambulism. Remember again, at the beginning of the night is when we tend to have our deep sleep, and somnambulism happens during deep sleep. So we're more likely to see sleepwalking during the early hours of the night. Also during slow wave sleep is when we see night terrors. So again, those are more common during the earlier hours of the night than the later hours. And then if you look later in the night, during the REM stage, we are more likely to see nightmares. And because REM periods get longer as we go through the night, in other words, as we get closer and closer to morning, REM periods get longer, it is more likely that if you're going to experience a nightmare, it's going to be closer to the time that you wake up. So it is often the case that we remember our bad dreams because they are more likely to happen when we are getting closer to waking up in the morning. If you take a look at the next slide, there is some information about dreams. Dreams are one of the most fascinating aspects of sleep that psychologists still cannot readily explain. We do understand that there are some common characteristics of dreams. Dreams tend to have common themes. The themes are usually things related to anxiety, and I'm going to talk about those in just a minute. But dreams often are commonly simply spillover from our daily experiences. And that is why people don't always remember their dreams. It is because they're so mundane. You know, having a dream about walking down the driveway to get the mail, or having a dream about driving to work or going through the drive-thru. They're so mundane that they're not even worth remembering, so they're often not even recorded. Usually the dreams that are remembered are the strange, bizarre, often funny dreams that we sometimes have. So dreams are often quite common, quite boring, and the result of a spillover from our daily experiences. In terms of the reasons for dreaming, we are still not sure what it is that causes dreams. There are three predominant theories as to the reasons as to why we dream, but none of these are really substantiated by any kind of clinical evidence. The first one is very Freudian in nature. If you remember, Freud believed that we have, in our unconscious mind, we have wishes, thoughts, desires, and conflicts. And those conflicts and wishes, although unconscious, may actually drive our behavior even if we're not aware of it. So Freud believed that dreams were a way for our unconscious mind to talk to our conscious mind, particularly with respect to wish fulfilling. So we may dream about things that are taboo or that we wouldn't even consider in a conscious waking state, but our unconscious mind is simmering under the surface, thinking about these unconscious wishes and desires, even if they are not appropriate. So those may bubble up to the surface and manifest themselves in a dream. Another theory for why we dream is that dreaming helps us problem solve. It helps us sort out information and allows us to make a good decision or have a clear solution to an issue. This may be why sometimes the advice given to someone who is having a problem is simply to sleep on it. Just sleep on it and the solution will come to you over the night or by the next morning. And sometimes that really does seem to happen. So that overnight the brain is working via dreams to try to find a solution to a problem. The last major theory about why we dream would be held by someone who is more of a biological psychologist in nature, someone like me, who would simply say that dreaming is simply the byproduct of random activation in the brain. In other words, we have activation of information from our different cortical areas, and the brain does its best to try to put it together in some sort of dream. And that is why sometimes dreams are so bizarre or so unusual or have different pieces from different areas in your life or things that you just can't explain, which often makes them quite amusing. So it could be that dreaming really is random. There is no meaning to it, and it simply is just a byproduct, a slideshow, if you will, of random activation of neurons while we're sleeping. If you take a look at the next slide, what you're going to see are the common themes in dreams that I just mentioned. And if you take a look at this list, you will notice that the majority of them are not necessarily pleasant dreams. In fact, some of the most common dream themes have an aspect of anxiety or fear or dread or apprehension associated with them. Now, of course, some of these dreams are fairly positive. Flying is a nice one. Being a child again might be a nice one. Eating delicious foods might be a nice one. Finding money is a great one. But notice a lot of these common themes in dreaming are not necessarily pleasant ones. For instance, the most common situation in a dream is being chased or pursued. Sexual experience is the next most common one. That can be pleasant. But then the next most common one is falling. And then for many people, the next most common dream of schools and teachers and studying may not be very pleasant at all. Then arriving too late, being on the verge of falling, trying again and again to do something, a person now alive is dead. Notice these all have a theme of being somewhat negative in nature, something you wouldn't necessarily want to dream about. Freud would say that these dream themes are manifestations of anxiety. That when we experience anxiety, we tend to dream about these negative events. And until we can uncover the cause of the anxiety or cognitively help ourselves out of that anxiety state, perhaps with the help of a therapist, we are going to continue to have dreams that have negative themes. Interestingly, the most common object that people dream about is teeth. Either your teeth are falling out, or you're biting someone, or being bitten, whatever the case may be, teeth, dreaming of teeth, is the most common object. I do want to mention too, in case you're interested, the record holder for the longest amount of sleep deprivation. As far as I know, the record was set in 1965 by a 17-year-old student and has not been broken yet. I may need to do some updating, but as far as I know, this record still stands. There was a young man by the name of Randy Gardner, and he stayed awake for 11 days and nights. 11 days and nights continually. So he was surrounded by people who kept him awake, kept him playing games or watching TV or movies or whatever it took to keep him awake. Interestingly, with sleep deprivation, people do tend to show some cognitive fuzziness. In other words, your ability to concentrate is compromised a little bit. Sometimes you might slur your words or have minor speech problems with sleep deprivation. But interestingly, this young man, for the most part, was able to stay alert and play games and be okay throughout his sleep deprivation period. So, if you can top 11 days and nights straight, you may have a new world record to set. This concludes the lecture on states of consciousness.